about Dracula at all, or is...
I mean in general, or do you mean in the book?
In the general story, is there like a need
I feel
to care about Dracula?
I feel like there's a, and I think it's a more modern view of it now. When the book was written, the idea that here are mainly women, with a couple of guys involved, if you include Renfield, who become under the thrall of this vicious monster, and he's not the book does not describe him as being attractive. They actually describe him as being old, fairly homely in appearance. There's something about him that's compelling, and he's hypnotic, and he's a sorcerer, and these people keep falling all over him, and you have to assume that it's because he's a monster and the devil and in league with Satan. And I think a modern audience has trouble understanding how people can connect to him and can fall, other air quotes, for someone like that if there isn't some romantic, maybe he's actually really attractive, or maybe he does have a dark past and he should be sympathized, and so it makes it a little bit more okay.
He's charming. And that's one of his defining characteristics, which I think is one of the only characteristics that I think is pervasive through every adaptation, through every retelling of it. And people who know more, please feel free to jump in. But as I understand it, Stoker based a lot of his mannerisms off of an actor he knew. Stoker was a theater manager, and he knew this incredibly charming actor, and he based a lot of the sort of gentlemanliness of Dracula off of this guy he knew. And I think that it's easy for modern readers to read Dracula and see that charm as being something more than what it is, which is just a deceptive mask. But I also think that especially modern readers, especially in the past 50, 60 years, we're not looking for the psychopathic killer. We're not looking for the, monster with no backstory. We want Darth Vader, and we want Voldemort. We want childhood traumas that have made you be this thing.
Right.
And audiences in 1879 were not necessarily looking for that.
Yeah. Victorian London did not care if you were abused as a child and you became a monster. You were a monster.
Yeah.
And I think Dracula was written as I think the reason that he's a classic monster because he's purely driven by a want for power. He just wants power, and he wants control, and he's evil.
What was really big at the time, too, in British literature was the idea of people invading Britain. So, British invasion fiction was super, super big. So he was also a symbol for Europe, or, Europeans coming into Britain to kind of reclaim it in a way. Not they could reclaim it, but, the way, similarly to how, they were going into other parts of, I guess, more of the Western world and staking claim and colonizing and everything. It was just a really big, his symbolism was as an invader.
Yeah, there's a word for that, isn't there? Invasion fiction? Or,
it's...
or empire fiction.
British invasion literature.
Which sounds like Rolling Stone fanfic.
Yeah.
But it's actually a thing.
It was really big from the mid to late 1800s.
And it's most specifically big in monster stories and fantasy stories and science fiction stories. Science fiction stories were all about that.
Oh yeah. And another thing, just real quick to touch on the romanticism of Dracula. I feel especially since a lot more people are probably more familiar with Bram Stoker's Dracula from the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola film, which was billed as an erotic horror fantasy film. And it, overly sexualized Dracula as, this dashing when he wasn't the super old guy, he's very, super charming.
He goes to
Gary
London,
Oldman.
turns into Gary Oldman, and everybody's like, excuse me.
Gary Oldman.
Yeah, of course you would go with Gary Oldman.
Charming man.
Yeah. But, and the advent of, Anne Rice and everything just overly sexualized vampires.
There's very definitely a progression in vampire literature from vampires being monsters to vampires being, misunderstood romantic figures. And, which the most unfortunate result of which is very visible in Twilight. also an element of sexuality to vampirism, full stop. There's a sexuality to the pulling of fluids from somebody's body and taking power out of that. And I think that there's been a lot of reading into that. I think there's been a lot of developing a sexual character out of a vampire because of that inherent power-driven thing. You know?
There's also penetration.
So much penetration. Great.
It is.
So we've talked a little bit about, Dracula is just a psychopathic killer, and we sort of touched on the sexuality of Dracula. There's also this Vlad the Impaler thing. Does anybody have any insights on that? Oh, yeah. Bring it on, sister.
Well, everybody knows the stories of, I don't recall precisely his timeline. I don't know if you are more adept at this.
Once upon a time.
But historically, he was a high-ranking official in Hungary?
Turkey.
Turkey, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, it was the Turkish
It was a Turkish war, so...
Oh, okay.
He was from Hungary.
Okay. But yeah, no, he was super into impaling and beheading people and was he was the one who posted their heads on stakes outside of his castle?
Yeah, there's all kinds of stories about this just super lovely guy who he would decapitate his opponents and stick their heads on stakes and basically line them up out in front of his castle as a warning to anybody else who might attack him. He also was famous for a torture method in which he would shave off the bottoms of people's feet and force them to walk in salt mines. There's a famous anecdote about him that some Turkish lord came to his house and refused to take off his turban, and so he had the turban nailed into his head. He's an infamous kind of historical figure, very violent, very terrifying, and I got all that information from a History Channel special. But he was a historic figure, and there's a lot of correlation between, is Dracula Vlad the Impaler, or is he a reinterpretation of Vlad the Impaler, or is he Vlad the Impaler reincarnate, which only has a little bit of basis in the book. There is a reference.
There's reference. There isn't any direct reference to Vlad the Impaler. There's references to him being from a very old Transylvanian noble family. There's a tombstone for Dracula himself outside of his castle. It says, there's a great big tombstone that says Dracula, so we know that whoever this guy is, he died.
Right.
And was buried, and so we know that he could have been a figure from the past who's just still around. They never directly reference Vlad Dracula by name.
Right, and the reason there is a correlation is because Bram Stoker took the name Dracula from Vlad the Impaler's family line. Vlad Dracula is his proper name, and so. And I, as far as I understand, in my research, Stoker was in Europe, and he thought to himself, that's a cool name.
Right.
And that's about it.
Well, it's really funny, because if you do research into Vlad the Impaler's family line, you find that the stuff that he did may have been awful, but if you look at the stuff that his dad did,
it was much
he would have looked fairly tame. They were a member of what was called the Order of the Dragon. Which is
that's Dracula. Yeah, that's
which is this really sadistic society kind of thing, and they did some awful stuff, and then the name just passed on to Vlad, and it was just kind of a family affair of just horrible things, which in terms with a lot of Bram Stoker's writing comes from, well, that sounded really cool. I have no idea what this actually is, but I read about it somewhere, and now I'm going to write about it here. Case in point, I'm sure we'll talk about that one American in the book. He had never really spent a lot of time with Americans, and you can tell, but he'd read about them, and they sounded a lot of fun.
And he wrote Quincy.
But the same with Vlad the Impaler. You hear that name, Vlad Dracula, that's a cool name. Oh, he did all this awful stuff. That's really cool. a man from that period, that space in Europe that I know nothing about, because obviously that part of Europe, Eastern Europe, is known for some pretty awful things.
Right.
Because of this kind of history. Obviously, people from there are capable of doing these barbaric things that are so behind what we as civilized members of the British Crown are capable of. And it's such a driving theme. I think it's the most prominent theme throughout the entire novel, is the difference between the old world that Dracula comes from, the world of magic and brutality, and that barbaric world, and the new world of London, where it's all rational thought, and everything has a reason, and we don't act like this because that's a terrible way to behave.
Right. It was also the beginning of the oh my gosh, I forgot the word. Industrial Revolution. There it is.
Right.
Found it.
It was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and so worldly centers like London had technologies that they didn't have in Transylvania, have in Eastern Europe. And it was also because it was during the Victorian Empire, a period in British history where they were going further and further out and conquering more and more and colonizing more and more and starting to sort of learn about other cultures. And but not, as anybody who has ever seen The Mikado can attest to. And it's definitely one of those pieces of literature, pieces of pop culture from that era that was trying to be a little worldly, but wasn't super successful.
And was written by somebody who himself was not super worldly. He just loved the idea of it. And there's some merit in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you could say the same about The Mikado.
Right.
But yeah, I read somewhere that the idea of the connection between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula wasn't really totally explored, wasn't really a part of the mythos of Dracula until like 1962, which is quite a while after the book was published. So I don't know. It's like, again, with that Francis Ford Coppola adaptation, they're leaning really hard on that idea, and they're using it to turn him into this tragic, romantic hero.
And they use, my pet peeve with all of those adaptations where the villain is supposed to be somehow romantic. They did it with The Mummy as well. This idea of seeking out your reincarnated lost love. And it's such a cop-out that is all those old horror movies that they remake. They made Dracula, they made The Mummy, they've done the same thing with Frankenstein. It's I'm seeking the reincarnation of my lost love because that is the only way to make me sympathetic and make it not creepy that I'm going after this woman.
Yeah,
because it's creepy.
Totally creepy.
But it's not creepy if she doesn't know that I actually do love her in a past life. It makes it less...
Yeah.
Right.
And then
But
it
also-
flashbacks where she sees that she is the woman from the past life.
Right.
Yes. It also completely takes away from Mina as a character.
Yes.
It reduces Mina's power. For those of us in the room whose name is Ashley, who is Mina?
Mina Hawker.
Somebody else want to take this?
Well, if you've never
She's
seen
a
League of
lady.
Extraordinary Gentlemen,
Oh, no. Read a comic. Read a comic.
Mina Harker is, Mina is, one of
The League of Extraordinary
the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
No, Mina Harker, so the book starts with Jonathan Harker, who's basically a real estate agent. He goes to Dracula's house, and he sort of gets captured by Dracula, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
He's engaged to this girl, Mina, and she kind of is the character who pulls everybody together. All of the connections in the book are Mina.
But she's just
her
a
best-
simple country